I'm Afshin Ratansi. We're going underground, digging up the narratives the so-called mainstream media won't give you. Coming up in the show. As Human Rights Watch in the Americas claims protests in the world cocaine capital of Colombia have seen a level of police violence previously unknown in Latin America. What is Britain's role, and why have UK soldiers been in Colombia, apparently? And why has China responded to lurid intelligence briefings in London and Washington that coronavirus escaped a Wuhan lab by pointing to a US laboratory 50 miles from the White House? All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, two British intelligence officials quoted across media here that it is feasible COVID-19 started in a lab in Wuhan, China. This as news emerges from Vietnam of a new devastating Anglo-Indian variant of coronavirus. Joining me now via Skype from Northampton in Massachusetts is Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and author of Washington Bullets, Vijay Prashad. Thanks so much, Vijay, for coming back on. I should say the Chief of the UK's General Staff, Sir Mark Carlton-Smith, hasn't been on this programme. He's talking at the MI6-linked Royal United Services Institute today about warfare. I mean, sure to come up is how the enemies of this country are China and Russia. It's repeated on and on. What do you make of these new CIA on that side of the pond and MI6 rumours that China created coronavirus in a lab?
Well, firstly, Afshin, it's great to be with you. I'm glad to see that you're healthy and as sharp as ever. Look, this is not a new allegation. This allegation goes right back to early 2020, when the Trump administration began to circulate a set of rumors that perhaps the Wuhan Institute of Virology or some other lab had leaked this virus, that it had nothing to do with human encroachment in nature. Now, repeatedly, this messaging has returned, despite the fact that it's been pretty well debunked by the World Health Organization, by other people who've looked at it pretty closely. It's not just the CIA. David Petraeus, former US general, started talking about the need for, protocols on an international scale, a kind of, just as the Chemical Weapons Treaty has a form of surveillance of places that have chemical manufacturing. There should be similar things.
Arguably, they've broken down in recent years, and David Petraeus, I'm not sure, given that he had to resign in disgrace, is the best source for any information.
He has no credibility, but what he was saying essentially was once more winking and nodding and suggesting that this has something to do with chemical weapons manufacturing, perhaps. All of this has been repeatedly debunked, but the Biden administration picking up just where the Trump administration left off.
I mean, I suppose we have to admit that it is feasible, such as everything is feasible in science. But I think what's different, and we've talked on this program about the way that Chinese officials now respond to Antony Blinken in Anchorage, and the way that now China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, so quick not to just quietly say, well, that's an American point of view. So quick to point to Fort Detrick, just 50 miles away from Washington, D.C., and say, what on earth has been going on in your germ warfare laboratory? What did you make of this Chinese response to the Biden administration allegations?
Well, look, I've followed Chinese diplomacy for years. I remember meeting Chinese diplomats in the Middle East. They used to be so cautious on the world stage. They'd always talk about every country has the right to its own internal affairs. One should not interfere and so on. In recent years, you don't see that. You see what, has been called a sort of wolf diplomacy, this much more aggressive form of reacting to US pressure. In Latin America, we've seen ambassadors write in the press. In last year, the ambassador in Chile, for instance, wrote in Clarín, called Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, a liar, much more aggressive responding. The Chinese, it seems to me, Afshin, have had enough of it. At Anchorage, Alaska, Antony Blinken opens the meeting, the first meeting at the highest level of the Biden administration with the Chinese government, by insulting the Chinese. I mean, instead of saying, look, welcome to Alaska. Alaska is the gateway to Asia for the United States. If you look on a clear day, you can see Moscow from Anchorage. Instead of those pleasantries, Blinken comes there and just insults the Chinese, saying, you don't understand the rules-based world order. Now, rules-based world order, we're now listening to this from the country that prosecuted the illegal war against Iraq, and etc. Councillor Wang just hit back hard at that meeting and said, what are you talking about? Rules-based order. I mean, what rules have you followed? One reason for this confidence is that China has been able now, finally, to be able to defend its borders. This is very important, this psychological aspect. You see, you've seen not only US shipping doing these so-called freedom of navigation moves in the South China Sea, but now the HMS Queen Elizabeth is going to join. You have German ships, French naval vessels in there off the coast of Korea and so on. The Chinese are saying, no, we're going to defend our border. We're not going to take this lying down. There used to be a theory earlier, Afshin, about, the trap at Malacca, the Straits of Malacca. The Chinese felt that oil particularly could be at any point cut off. They are not so dependent anymore. Because of the Belt and Road, it's because of the ability of the Chinese to drive an economic project that seems to be much more successful than the economic projects in Europe, in the UK, in the US, and so on.
Well, British viewers can be assured that the Boris Johnson government has sent our warship there to protect British interests, obviously. I mean, not everyone who's a journalist reads your books, perhaps, and read your most recent one, Washington Bullets. But when this rumor of the Chinese lab coronavirus came out, is it just expected from the authorities, whether it be in MI6 around the corner from here or in Langley at the CIA, that the reporters will just flip from Trump is an idiot, why is he saying it's a Wuhan laboratory, to Biden says it could be, it may well be a communist coronavirus virus?
Well, I've been to your office and I've looked out of your window and I've seen the MI6 building, and it presents a very formidable view from where you're sitting. So I hope they listen to this. Just because you at MI6 say something doesn't mean that the rest of us in the world believe it. We are not that credulous. We are not stenographers of the security state in the West. We would like to look at the evidence, and I'd prefer to listen to epidemiologists who look at the evidence, who've looked at the sequencing of this particular virus, and they understand that the sequencing of the virus demonstrates that it's much more likely to have developed by moving between various animals and then eventually leaping to humans than leaping out of a test tube. And yet the intelligence services continue to speak in that language. Of course, it's true that journalists who are liberals will say, look, Trump was a little nutty, but if Biden says it, or if, the Mandarins at MI6 say it, there's probably more credibility. Why listen to them? Why not listen to the scientists? If only Boris Johnson listened to the science early in 2020, if only Trump listened to the science in early 2020. Well, I'm now asking fellow journalists, why not talk to the scientists to learn about what's in the DNA sequence of the virus? Get that evidence. Let them tell you about that. Don't listen to the briefings from, the shadows, from intelligence services, where they are disparaging the science in order to make a political point.
Well, Trump and Johnson say they've done the best they can. Johnson's announced an inquiry which may start next year. What about this Chinese allegation? People can watch our interview about MK Ultra and the relations to germ warfare at Fort Detrick on our YouTube channel. I mean, just give us a rundown of why the United States has 600 buildings, around 13,000 acres apparently. The WHO haven't looked into it. Do you think the USA will ever open Fort Detrick, which the CDC shut down in September? Was it August 2019? Just as now we discover some sightings of coronavirus around the world?
Well, I don't know if it's really shut down, because these are sites that are not inspected by independent observers. Look, there's a lot of evidence, Afshin, going back to the 19th century of various forms of chemical and biological weaponry produced by the United States government. There's a lot of evidence. They've used it. I mean, for God's sake, we forget that in Vietnam, the United States used chemical weapons against that population, by which I mean napalm. It's the next worst thing after a nuclear bomb. David Petraeus can say whatever he wants about the need for surveillance of biological, manufacturing of different kind of potential weaponry. Well, the US has never allowed inspections of any of its sites. So, I mean, I'm not confident that anything is actually shut down. And I take the Chinese accusation seriously. It's one thing to accept what a government says and, believe that they are being completely honest and that they are being, genuine about what they're saying. And it's another to allow independent inspections. Let's remember what Iraq was made to do in the 1990s when people like Hans Blick and others went from site to site inspecting things. I look forward to the day when sites such as this are opened up in the United Kingdom. Let's go and investigate the United Kingdom's own chemical weapons and germ weapons laboratories. Perhaps they exist. We don't know. What's good for the goose has never been good for the gander. You remember the early part of the Trump administration, they used the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. Journalists were not permitted to go to the site to see what had happened there. Journalists were stopped. We were given press cards by the Pentagon about how to report that story. Most of the reporting is identical.
Just finally and briefly, in part two, we're going to be talking about Colombia and Britain's links to what's been happening in Colombia. Very briefly, because I haven't spoken to you since, apart from what happened in Ecuador, where a pro-American has been elected, hopes that a pink tide may be returning. We've now seen all the fake corruption, as it turns out, allegations against Lula overturned. We've seen changes in Bolivia, and we see Maduro continuing to lead Venezuela.
There are several elections that are going to be on the horizon, very important. On Sunday, in early June, you're going to see an election, the second round in Peru, where Pedro Castillo, a man of the left, a school teacher from rural Peru, most likely is going to win the election. He'll triumph over the daughter of Mr. Fujimori, who was the dictator in the 1990s. Very significant. In November, Daniel Jadwe, a member of the Communist Party in Chile, will be the candidate of the left. Polls show that he is ahead of any other candidate in Chile. This is very significant. But the place to look at, Afshin, is Colombia, where this current violence epicenter being Cali is being used by the government of Ivan Duque to try and delegitimize next year's presidential candidate, Gustavo Petro. They are saying Mr. Duque is accusing him of terrorism, of associations with armed violence and so on. This is disturbing because Mr. Ivan Duque and his predecessor Uribe have a history of trying to delegitimize the left in order to have a triumphant return to power. I don't know if it's a pink tide, Afshin. I don't know if it's any kind of tide, but certainly something is happening in South America, and I'm really glad that it's being covered by reporters like yourself.
Vijay, Prashad, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
After the break, as the death toll mounts in the world's go-to cocaine country, Colombia, why is the British Army helping security forces 5,000 miles from London that human rights groups blame for mass slaughter? All this and more coming up in part two of Going Underground. Thanks for watching this Going Underground interview. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel with notifications on to never miss an interview. Now it's your turn. Tell us what you think by commenting below and getting in touch via our social media. See you next time. All that is solid melts into air.